So with no further ado, take the floor, Tiffany. Thank you so much for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Erica, for that introduction, and to all of the Photovoice team. It's just a really exciting conference for me. The idea of being surrounded by all sorts of people who are a bit Photovoice nuts, like I've been for many years, is super exciting. So it's a huge honor to be here. Thank you to Erica, Laura, Leanne, everyone for bringing us all together. I feel like it's been long overdue. So it's fantastic. And I've loved the events that I've been in so far. So let me pull up my screen to share my presentation and we can get going. Okay, it's in completely the wrong place at the end. That's helpful. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just get out of this. Of course, I had it all organized and now it's not. 1 second. I can get on to that. This is me being overly cautious about, make sure I had it in the right place. And of course now it's in the wrong place. Okay, brilliant. I think I've got it there. Let me try and reshare. Sorry for the confusion. Okay, so can you all see my presentation okay?
Yes,
yeah?
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so yes, the first thing I'm going to be talking today about Photovoice and how it might work as a form of peace photography, and this relates to my current research fellowship. But before I do that, I want to kind of quickly dip into a bit of my background for a couple of minutes, because that very much informs my current research. So I have actually been working with Photovoice for a good 25 years now. And when I first started as an undergraduate, as you can see, looking very fresh-faced, I was working with some young people in Nepal who were living as refugees in Bhutanese refugee camps in Nepal. I came to participatory photography and Photovoice as a visual practitioner rather than as a researcher. And so in this sense, I first learned and was kind of working with notions of Photovoice before I even knew about Caroline Wang and Marianne Burris's work. And I guess that has continued to inform my practice, where I've drawn a lot on participatory photography practices and community photography practice, as well as the incredible legacy that has come out of Photovoice as a research method. So since first working with participatory photography about 25 years ago, I went on and set up an organization called Photovoice in the UK, again, not really knowing enough at all about Caroline Wang's work. And then thankfully have got to learn a lot more since. But I've worked on Photovoice and participatory photography projects of all shapes and sizes in the years since, and can genuinely say that every single one teaches me something new. Even though I've been doing this a long time, I definitely don't feel like any kind of expert, because every kind of context and scenario project brings with it completely different dynamics. And in this sense, I very much view Photovoice as something that kind of gets reinvented each time you do it, as a kind of flexible and adaptive practice. But we can talk more about that. After founding and running Photovoice for 10 years, I went and did my PhD at Goldsmiths in visual sociology, and I looked at the ethics and impact of participatory photography projects, particularly in the NGO area. And I'm now based at King's College London, where I've been doing research into art-based peace building. I'm in the Department of War Studies. And what I want to talk about today is Photovoice as a form of peace photography. So the first place really for me to start is to talk a little bit about this concept of peace photography.
Tiffany, sorry to interrupt you. We're seeing the same slide, so
you're not
sure if you move.
Okay.
Yeah, we're only seeing the same.
It's
slide.
saying that the screen sharing is paused. How strange. I'm going to try and start resharing again.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. How are we doing now? Are you seeing a picture of a street?
Yes, we do. Do you want to try
Brilliant.
move forward and this time to see if
Is that all working? Is it shifting
Yes,
around?
it's working well.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So I will jump back in then. So I guess to talk about, like all image crazy people to weigh into a concept is sometimes to just think about it for a picture. So I want to show you a picture first of all to talk about this idea of peace photography. This picture provides an ordinary street view. It's pretty unremarkable. And I guess a lot of us wouldn't think much of it. But the reality is that this street, which is Waterlooville Street, it's in Belfast in Northern Ireland. This isn't the actual view that you would see if you were standing in this position on the street. The actual view would be of this is a Google Street Map image. The actual view would be of this kind of 30-foot high wall. And this is one of Belfast's many peace walls. They've been erected over the years of the Troubles and continuing after the Troubles, and they were erected to keep communities apart. Now, the image that we were looking at, go back to it here, is actually a composite image that was taken, was constructed by young people who came together in a photography workshop with Belfast Expose, who are an organisation based in Belfast who have been working for many, many years in community photography projects. And for this project, two groups of young people came together, and they were groups that lived on either side of the peace wall. So as a group of young Protestants and a group of young Catholic from the Catholic community and Protestant community, and they worked with a facilitator, taking a lot of views from either side of the wall and then constructing this image in Photoshop to try and give an idea of what the street would look like if the wall wasn't there. And to us, or people from outside of Belfast, this seems like a kind of very ordinary street view, but of course to the residents in that area, it's a view that hasn't been seen in a good 50 years. And for me, this image really speaks directly to the heart of what peace photography is about. That there's one of the leading kind of pioneers of peace studies and peace thinkers, peace scholars, is called Jean-Paul Leverhulme. And he talks a lot about peace as potentiality. And that's this idea of being able to imagine what doesn't yet exist. So for communities that are living with legacies of conflict, often peace is so far from a kind of day-to-day reality that in order to build and fight for peace, it requires a certain amount of kind of utopian deep thinking, or Jean-Paul Leverhulme uses the concept of a moral imagination, and that's his capacity to imagine while you're rooted in the day-to-day reality of a situation where there might be legacies of conflict, but to still imagine what peace might look like. And this kind of image directly kind of disrupts the idea of what we can and can't see within conflict. So these young people, in a way, are envisaging what doesn't exist. And so this idea kind of speaks directly to peace photography. Now, part of the issue that peace photography is looking to kind of tackle in a way is this idea that war is so visible, so that, you know, the history of photojournalism and documentary photography has been defined by iconic images of war. I'm sure many of us here are not only fans of Photovoice, but of visual histories and photographic histories. And of course, we all, I'm sure, have iconic images of war splintering all of our imaginations, and they serve to remind us and educate us as the horrors of violence and conflict. We celebrate the work of great war photographers. There are exhibitions, books, films, and volumes of research that extensively focus on the photography of violence and conflict. The critical literature has also considered photography's fixation and even collusion with conflict. But what about peace? So if you do a quick Google image search, you will find images of war. We, of course, will find endless photography of war. Of course, sadly, at the moment, this is largely around the war in Ukraine. But when we do a similar image search in Google for peace, we're confronted with a whole lot of kind of generic symbols and very few actual photographic images. So we've got the CNDs and the doves, people, we've got people holding hands and meditating. But there's a kind of critical question here, is why don't we have any visual images or photographic images of peace? And why do we not have images that speak to the very active and brave work that people who are living in sites of conflict or living with legacies of conflict and violence all over the world, the very important work that they're doing that actually show what it means to build peace and what matters to peace. So it's this idea that actually in photographic terms, peace is largely invisible. So while photojournalism assigns priority to representations of conflict rather than peace, it means more often than not, when peace is referenced in photojournalism, for example, it's understood in negative terms, so as an absence of violence. So peace is always viewed through the prism of war. And the problem with this approach is it tends to strip the people who are involved, the communities who are affected by conflict, it tends to strip them of agency as they're designated as victims. And this will be an issue to many people here who I'm sure working with different kinds of marginalized groups, this idea of people in photographic and representations and images being designated as victims. And this is deeply problematic in a world dominated by images, because of course images don't only represent and depict the world around us, but they actively shape it. They do things. Images are forces, they circulate rapidly, they have political significance because they mediate our relations with each other and shape how we see the world, which shapes our actions and behavior. So by only representing peace through the prisms of war, photography is contributing to its invisibility, and it reinforces also the idea that conflict and violence are inevitable. And of course, that's not the case, because there are many brilliant people who are doing amazing work to build peace under very tough circumstances. So a number of thinkers in peace and conflict studies have started to, I guess, evolve or try to push thinking around the idea of visual peace and visual peace research. And they've asked, what might a photography of peace consist of? Of course, a genre of peace photography doesn't yet exist in the professional discourse on images, but in recent years, these thinkers have been trying to push this idea. And these are thinkers from within peace and conflict studies, within international relations, but also within the photographic world. So Fred Richin proposed this question, what might a photography of peace consist of? And Frank Muller as well, he has done a lot of work to try and conceptualize this idea of peace photography. And he defines peace photography as being concerned with not only the representation of peace, but how these representations can contribute to and actively anticipate peace. And I would push that a little bit further and not just say how representations of peace can contribute to and anticipate peace, but how actually image making itself, the process of participatory image making, might do that. So in their thinking, a number of researchers and academics have started to identify some of the kind of characteristics of peace photography. And I'm not going to go in depth, but they're up there on the screen. So this idea that peace photography is proactive, it's kind of strategically seeking to harness and nurture peace, that it's process orientated, that it's plural, because of course, peace means very different things to different people, depending on what cultures you come from and depending from your own background. So it's this idea that there isn't really a fixed idea of what peace photography might be, but it doesn't involve a particular aesthetic. And then, of course, that it's future orientated. And I guess we could reflect a bit on the conference logo here, thinking of past, present, and future. A lot of key peace theory specifies how the key really to peace building processes is this thing of not only looking back and acknowledging the past and what's happened with legacies of conflict, but also looking to the future to try and build something new. So peace photography is really about this agenda, or this kind of motive really to envision positive forms of peace. Stuart Allen, who is a journalism professor who has written about peace photography, he has argued that peace photography requires nothing less than a profound reimagining of the photographic form. And as I was kind of researching all this literature, I, of course, with my background in Photovoice and participatory photography, was thinking, well, I know exactly where that profound reimagining of form comes from. And I could think of many projects and work that has happened, Photovoice work and participatory photography work has happened in post-conflict or conflict situations, which would qualify as forms of peace photography. But much of the existing research into peace photography has really only considered it through professional image making. So they've looked at the work of photojournalists or artists or just professionally driven imagery. So my I guess contention and kind of aim with my research now is to really think about what participatory photography and what forms of photo voice contribute, I guess, to this notion of peace photography. And also, I guess, there's an agenda to kind of stake a claim for the huge significant component that I think that peace participatory photography can that it should consist that peace photography as a significant component of peace photography should be participatory forms of image making. Yesterday, Claudia Mitchell in her talk was talking about images that haunt. This is an image by a young girl called Mahbouba that I worked with about 20 years ago in Afghanistan, just after the fall of the Taliban. And it's one of these images that's always haunted me, in part because, well, you can see it's a picture of a bath. We had gone to photograph in this ruined, it was a kind of grand palace, it was a ruined palace. And a few months, sometime after, I was in a photo gallery in London, and I stumbled across a photograph of this very same bath. It was actually being sold for 3,000 euros. It was by a European photographer, and it kind of came with a title, Untitled, or, you know, one of this. And it was a beautiful image of this ruined bath. But Mahbouba's image just kept on coming back to me because it told me so much more about what peace consisted of and about what it meant to live with and try to, I guess, move forward when you're dealing with such huge histories of loss and conflict. So I guess my background in Photovoice and participatory photography showed me that there was this wealth of work being produced by conflict affected communities that really spoke to the importance of, had a wealth of knowledge to provide, contribute to this notion of peace photography, but also to peace and conflict studies. So my current research here now is really about trying to do empirical research to study how local practitioners who are living in countries that are dealing with legacies of conflict and violence, how local practitioners are harnessing community engaged photography, photo voice, participatory photography, how they're using them within their communities to contribute to peace building and reconciliation processes. So this is a bit about the entire research project. I'm about halfway through at the moment. So this stuff that the work that I'm sharing with you is very much research in progress. And that's why I really welcome all feedback and thoughts, because it's all still very much in a process of coming together. But the key research questions are really about the role that photography, and I guess within that I transpose every word, photography with participatory forms of photography and photo voice can help, how it might help frames the conditions of possibility to peace. So here I'm really looking at how images and participatory processes of image making are being strategically harnessed by local practitioners, that's visual practitioners, NGOs, researchers, to build relations, to catalyze dialogue and to create new imaginaries of peace, and with what impact. So as I said, I am working with some amazing partners all over the world. Unfortunately, not all the slides seem to have come up, but their logos would all be here and you'd see them. But I'm working and building case studies in 6 countries, and there are a few others as well that I think will come in. And each project, and the way that I'm working with each project and case study, is very different. I'm not going to go into all the detail of that, but these are some of the partners I'm working with. You'll see they range from photography organizations to NGOs, so visual practitioners, and research entities. And the methods quickly that I'm using are, in some of the case studies and countries, I'm actually actively involved in the projects. So it's a form of action research, using Photovoice and participatory photography. But I'm also doing longitudinal case studies on projects or practitioners that have been working over long periods to understand their work better in process. And I'm doing a lot of active interviewing using photo elicitation with these practitioners. Of course, like most of us, I'm sure at this conference, we've had to kind of pivot a bit during the pandemic to work a lot more at distance. And it's actually been incredibly productive for this research. I've been able to work with incredible practitioners, and we've been able to do a lot at distance. So I want to quickly speak to this idea of this expansive form of photo voice that I'm working with in this research. And as I say, it probably goes back to the fact that I came to photo voice through a practice route rather than a research route. Caroline Wang's and Marianne Burris's, all that work is foundational in terms of building a theoretical base for this work. And in that sense, we owe a debt to Caroline Wang. But what reason I'm bringing it up is I'm not very precise with terminology, because for me, all of these kind of practices and methods kind of merge into one. I guess what I'm interested in is the strategic application of these methods. And so in these projects, we'll see all sorts of forms of photo mentoring, therapeutic photography, cross-community photography. So this slide is really speaking to some of the terms. And for me, participatory photography, photo voice, community photography are all part of a similar spectrum. They are all focused on a form of photography where community members and participants are the ones driving the image making. And that image making has been very much done to drive some form of transformation. So that is where the kind of core of this work is. And as I say, my focus is on the kind of specific contextual adaptations and how it's being used. These forms of participatory image making are being used within particular contexts, rather than, I don't work with a fixed methodological photo voice practice. As I said at the beginning, I very much see photo voice as something that gets reinvented each time it's used, and I use it as an adaptive rather than standard practice. And this is why forums like this are so incredible, because we get to really learn and see how other people are using it. And it's one of the hopes with this research is that we can create more resources and more kind of ideas and inspiration around methods to see how different people are using and adapting them in different parts of the world. So I'm quickly going to talk about peace as well, because there are, of course, many different forms of peace, and to different people, peace would signify different things. In peace theory, or even international relations, or a lot of the researchers and scholars where I'm based at the Department of War Studies, in peace and conflict studies, basically, there's been a shift away from a move towards what they call the local term within a turn in peace building, where there's been a much stronger acknowledgement and recognition and focus on the role of local actors in building and sustaining peace. And this, of course, is I guess a kickback or an acknowledgement of the failures of a lot of the liberal peace building model, that where the emphasis was very much on the state and the institutions, so a kind of form of top-down peace building, and their role in enacting and pursuing peace in post-conflict reconstructions. So this shift away from top-down peace building and an acknowledgement of the importance of bottom-up forms of peace building means that the time is right when a lot of the theory now within peace studies is really focusing us on forms of bottom-up and small-scale peace. And this is very much where my research is located. I'm interested in how photography is being used at a community level to support peace building processes. I just got a review back from a paper with I think a rather exasperated reviewer saying, but how is handing out cameras going to bring peace? And that, of course, is not the claim of these projects. The kind of piece that they're concerned with is supporting community-based processes that can't necessarily directly end conflict or war, but what they can do is foster and nurture peaceful cultures, dialogue, reconciliation, support the healing, rebuilding of relationships that need to happen at a community level, and that really build on the kind of strengths that are already there in the community to drive peace at the grassroots level. So one area in theory is this notion of everyday peace. I won't go into it a lot, but this is a framework that has generated a lot of attention in peace building studies, which really focuses on the actions and behaviors used day to day by people who are affected by conflict. They're kind of coping and survival strategies, the routine practices that people employ to avoid or resist conflict. And they really, again, all of these frameworks locate local actors as the key agents of peace building. And this notion of everyday peace is really driven by a scholar called Roger McGinty. And he talks about everyday peace power as being the potential for these very small scale forms of peace to disrupt and transform the logic of conflict. So I've got a quote here from John Paul Lederach again, whose work is really pioneering in peace building. And he talks a lot about the importance of creativity in peace building. And he himself resorts a lot to the arts. And for him, peace is understood to be a very complex process that needs to work across all levels of society and is really rooted in the reparation of relationships. And he uses, as I said, this concept of the moral imagination, which I've already mentioned, which requires people to kind of imagine what yet doesn't exist. And he very much puts the emphasis on the innovation and risk that's required to really drive peace. So jumping now, I'd like to go straight to some of the projects that I've been looking at. Sadly, there isn't enough time or space, and I'm kind of midway through the research, so to share all of it. But I hope this will give you a flavour of some of the projects that I've been working with. I'm going to talk to you more in depth about the one that I've been working on in Colombia, and then give you a little kind of flavour of ones in other countries. As I say, all of this I'm publishing on and writing on in the next few years, so do just keep following the research as it comes out. But the reason I've chosen to start with the work in Colombia is because this is very much a Photovoice focused project. Are you guys seeing the screen, the slides for me? A lot of the visuals aren't coming up. Is that the same for you guys? I don't know, Leanne, if you could say.
We can see.
Brilliant. Okay, can you, but are there images here?
No, not there. Not yet.
They don't seem to have downloaded. Okay, because we need those images. Otherwise, what I might quickly do is stop sharing and try and share again to see if it downloads. Sorry about this, but without the images, the whole thing becomes a bit
no worries
to talk about.
If anybody wants to start commenting or post questions in the chat, we're happy to start welcoming them, and then we'll address them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A.
Now let's see if this is. Have you got a screen? Is it shared?
I think it's coming. It says that you have started. Yeah, it's coming.
Oh, there's no images. So what I'm going to do, let's see if the video works at least. Yay. Okay, the video is working. So I'm going to talk over the video, and then I'm going to jump to a PDF that has some of the images. But in Colombia, I've been supporting a project that has been run by an NGO called Everyday Peace Indicators. Now, Everyday Peace Indicators, I should say a bit about their work. They use a participatory numbers process, and they're really working against the backdrop where the power of indicators in determining success in peace building policy and programming. So indicators are ordinarily set by external experts and involve, they often use universal categories despite extensive research that demonstrates how peace is understood differently in different places. So what Everyday Peace Indicators do is they work with communities so communities can devise their own indicators of peace, coexistence, and justice. And they've developed this kind of 4-stage verification process where they work with different groups in the community, so men, women, youth, to develop big, long lists and indicators of peace. And these are then further verified through a community process, and they're used to make surveys that are then used to monitor and understand the impact of peace building interventions. So Photovoice has been integrated into this process, in the Everyday Peace Indicators process in Colombia, as part of a kind of an attempt to mix participatory methods to kind of amplify the power and capacities of both participatory numbers methods and participatory visual methods. Now, in Colombia, Everyday Peace Indicators are working in 3 different regions with communities who have been directly affected by the conflict, the kind of 5 decades of conflict in Colombia. And they are working in areas where, despite the 2016 peace accord, peace is still incredibly fragile. There are armed groups that have moved into the vacuums left by the FARC, and many areas are still controlled by armed groups linked to narco trafficking and other illicit industries. And they are living in an environment where there are increased killings of community leaders. So despite the supposed peace process, the communities themselves are not living in secure environment. Now, I'm really annoyed that the images aren't sharing, so I'm just going to jump. I've also got a PDF of this presentation because I just was worried about something like this happening. So what I'm going to do is quickly share that instead so we can see the pictures, because without those pictures, it all doesn't quite make sense. So where are you, PDF? Okay. So sorry about that. We'll go to the non-techie version. Always ends up being the way. So why won't you let me show the next one? There we are. So this is a couple of slides to show you something of the Everyday Peace process, but they start by asking community members to identify their own measures of peace. And what you saw in the video with these big long lists of peace indicators. And what we do with Photovoice is we then work to integrate, after the Everyday Peace Indicators process has happened in the community, there was an open call, so there was an open invitation to anyone in the community to join a Photovoice project. And Photovoice workshops happened over a period of about 6 weeks in different communities. The demand was so great we had to create 2 groups, but in general the groups were around 25 participants. And the Photovoice, there'd be initial fun getting to know the camera, taking pictures workshops, but after that initial phase, and people were feeling confident with using the camera, participants or community members would select some of their peace indicators that have been generated through the everyday peace process. And they would choose ones that particularly resonated with them, and they would then develop photo stories out of them. Now, within the Photovoice group, they selected indicators as individuals, but each group also selected an indicator that they developed a collective story out of. So there was a kind of simultaneous individual and collective processes going on in terms of the image making. But once they built these photo stories, they out of the indicators, there were then large community exhibitions where images were hung all over the community, and it all got waylaid by COVID a bit, but we ended up doing a lot on social media as well. But essentially the images were hung all over the village to kind of create the ideas of big kind of outdoor peace museums. Now, I just want to talk a bit about the reason, the kind of research design and the motivation for mixing Photovoice with everyday peace indicators. It was really about this idea of trying to combine different participatory methods to mitigate in a way against the limitations of each of them, and to find participatory methods that could complement and amplify each other to build more robust and expansive research that could attend to policy change agendas, because everyday peace indicators work is looking to inform policy and to get the community voices heard at the level of policy to inform some of the peace building mechanisms that are currently underway in Colombia. But also they were very much wanting to attend to the community level peace building and community actions. So everyday peace indicators, EPI, I'll call it for now, is controlled as a research process. It's participatory, but it's controlled by a much stricter research protocol that is researcher controlled. There are levels of the analysis that are undertaken that are researcher led. It's not all done through a participatory analysis. And while obviously all the indicators very much come from the community, the data some of the data is flattened and lost when these are just made into indicators. And so there was very much a desire on part of the research team to find a way that communities could kind of reclaim these indicators and use them to drive peace within their own communities. And so the Photovoice, some of its limits when it works with very small groups, of course, is that it can't necessarily be representative of all the concerns in the community. And what was really interesting in this project is because the Photovoice group were already working with indicators that had been generated by the community as a whole, is that Photovoice, I guess, attended to the community concerns on a much broader level than a Photovoice project on its own can ever do. We worked a lot with the notion of inclusive rigor, which is a concept developed by Robert Chambers. And we were trying to really create multiple ways of knowing for action, which is another idea that from action research, where it's this idea of trying to embrace the complexity and plurality in terms of the lived experience of communities and how they experience peace building processes. And it was trying to be, I guess, more inclusive while also being rigorous. I really encourage anyone to look at this concept of inclusive rigor. It's fantastic, but it basically speaks to this idea about how often in research, the notion of rigor ends up reducing the data by kind of putting constraints on it according to strict controls and standardized environments and things. And actually, when you're working in complex research settings like post-conflict settings, we really need to find a form of rigor that's expansive and inclusive. And Robert Chambers really names methodological bricolage as key to this. So this is really what we were kind of experimenting with this project. And in terms of some of the outcomes, we conducted evaluative research in the first two communities, and what very much came back was the idea of how these Photovoice processes supported healing and intergenerational dialogue, because the groups were made up of lots of different members of the community. We found that it started conversations between the different generations that weren't happening. There was also a great sense of pride in terms of representing the villages, but this also with the exhibitions, but also this idea of reclaiming of space. So in plastering the images all over the village, in Colombia in particular, a feature of the conflict has been that armed groups would use graffiti, and graffiti would cover walls, and this graffiti often was a way of exerting control, involved, they would be kind of aggressive and violent threats in the graffiti. So the community, I guess, in mounting the exhibition, it was this idea of reclaiming the space with messages of peace rather than messages of violence. But one thing that was really interesting that also happened that wasn't originally planned was that out of the collective indicator, I don't know how much you can read this, but out of the collective indicator process as well, the Photovoice groups ended up taking kind of community actions on the back of them. So to give you an example, one of the collective indicator stories in San Jose de Rama was around the state of dilapidation of the cemetery. And the Photovoice group went and photographed the cemetery. And on the back of, when they were discussing their images and looking at their images, there's a kind of a decision made that they must do something about it, and work parties were called, and over 80 people in the village came together to totally rehabilitate the cemetery. In another example, another collective photo indicator project was around issues of rubbish and recycling, and that led to the reinitiation of a recycling project. And in another, it led to a community reaching out to an ex-combatant community and going visiting and having an exchange with an ex-combatant community, and readjusting their attitudes towards that community, because essentially there was a lot of tension around the fact that as part of the peace accord process, ex-combatant communities had been provided with new services and facilities, and victim communities had not been given the same kind of state support, and this is creating a lot of tension. By photographing, I guess, the lack of services in their own community, and then going to visit an ex-combatant community where they photographed there, photography became a means to kind of mediate an exchange with this ex-combatant community. So what we saw happening was this potential, I guess, for dialogue and exchange. I'm going to see if I can jump back now to this and see if this will work any better. And because I'm kind of rapidly running out of time, as I knew would be the case, I'm going to, sadly, I'm not going to have time to show you all the other, sorry, let me just get to the right place. I was trying to be too clever with this thing, this always happens. I'm going to jump to Rwanda quickly, to the project here in Rwanda. In Rwanda, I've been working with a photographer called Jacques Nikinzavo. He runs the Kigali Center for Photography, and he has been running a photo mentoring project where he works with young people and mentors them to produce stories, photo stories on issues that they feel are important to their community. What you're seeing now are pictures from some of these stories. This is by a young photographer called Richard, who photographed young mothers in his community. And what they do once they produce their photo stories is they hold exhibitions in their houses, and they invite their neighbors in to talk about the issues depicted in the images. And this is against a backdrop where, since the genocide, while in many senses Rwanda is held up as a kind of emblem of reconciliation in terms of what's been achieved, since the genocide, there's still, trust is still not, there's still huge challenges to rebuilding trust at a community level. And Jacques talks about how people no longer invite each other around to their houses. So houses have really become much more kind of closed spaces. And this is Jacques in the video there standing, and this is Richard introducing his photo project.
I'm interrupting you again because we can't see the picture and the video. We are on the main cover.
Oh, really? So you've not seen any of that? Oh, God, this is the last time I try and do something techie. I am going to go back to the PDF. apologies to this, but I hope it, I can share the link to, I'll be able to share the link to the presentation with the recording so people can have a flick through themselves. So I'll do that. I'm just going to share the PDF for now, and I'm going to jump to the end because I want to make sure that there's still time for to have some questions. The things that I'm sadly skipping by, this is the work in Bosnia with a peace building NGO called Post-Conflict Research Center. They do incredible youth media training work, and where they work with young people to find kind of positive peace building stories in an environment where there are 3 different versions of history. There are very entrenched narratives, and there are very few stories or images that speak to a multi-ethnic platform. And they're working, as I say, to support and train young people. They do incredible things, which another time I hope I'll be able to tell you more. And finally, this is work in Northern Ireland, where Belfast Exposed have been working over 30 years. They do all sorts of forms of therapeutic photography and cross-community photography, which again, I hope at another point to be able to talk to you more widely about. So I am looking for the last slide that doesn't, oh my God, everything's going. So I'm going to, the last slide isn't there. I am going to stop sharing and go back and hope it's here. I apologize for this. Could you, Erica, just tell me what you guys are seeing in terms of, do you see the final Photovoice's piece photography slide?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up now to just really share with you some of my reflections. As I say, this is very much work in progress, and the findings are ongoing, and I'm sure there are wealth of knowledge and experience within this conference who might be able to offer up reflections. But I guess a lot of what these projects speak to, even though they're using very expansive forms of participatory photography, as I say, they still speak to the core of what I feel the Photovoice process is, which is about kind of sparking and fostering this critical thinking and potential for change and action. And the really key thing across all of these projects is this very kind of strategic and intentional application of participatory visual methods to build on existing capacities, processes, and strengths. And this is something that researchers like Foster Fishman have noted since the beginning with Photovoice, that its greatest impact is often due to a combination of opportunities and wider factors rather than solely attributable to the Photovoice process itself. So Photovoices and participatory photography here are very much understood as complementary and amplifying processes to peace. And then also this idea of images as mediators to enable conversations that are difficult or sensitive and to open up, much as, you know, Jacques' example of what he's doing in Rwanda. I didn't have time to go into the detail of that case study, but what's incredible in Rwanda is there's very kind of strict protocols around community meetings about who gets to speak and when. And Jacques really talks about the power of the image to break down those barriers. What he does is he puts images that the young people put their images all over the chairs at their exhibitions, in photo albums, not just on the walls. And before they even introduce their projects, they ask people to look at the pictures and tell them what's going on. So this is, and it immediately reverses the dynamic, the traditional dynamic, and kind of enables and facilitates dialogues that really haven't been happening or are very rare in community spaces in Rwanda at present. So it's this idea of images as breaking the ice and catalyzing exchanges. The future looking and solution orientated, that particularly comes across in the work from Bosnia, but also this idea of the flexibility of photography and the versatility of Photovoice and participatory image making to enable communities that are recovering to either work explicitly or implicitly to foster peace, because of course people are often in different places, and some might not want to speak directly to things that have happened or directly to peace, but Photovoice kind of allows for both of those things to happen simultaneously. The other thing that comes across really strongly in all of the projects that I'm looking at is it's very much about doing Photovoice for local audiences and to using it within local communities to rebuild relationships, to carve these spaces. And there's much less emphasis on the kind of national level or policy audience, although that is happening in some of these projects. But the real focus is on this kind of critical process that is happening within communities. I just want to say one thing about the limited and constrained nature. I've spoken a bit to what extent photography can really affect peace in terms of big P, and of course there are all sorts of security constraints on these kinds of projects in terms of what is safe to show and not show for communities that are still living often with the threat of conflict and violence. But I think the key thing is, even though it is limited and constrained, these projects still create something really significant in terms of what it can do at a small scale to support peace and dialogue, in terms of going back, disrupting these conflict narratives, supporting communities to reclaim narratives, to inspire hope, to kind of confront, I guess, and challenge the logic of conflict and violence, and also to restore relations. And of course, this small scale change has the potential to ripple out. I just want to end with a point made by Professor Britton Lykes, who of course is one of the involved in this conference here, whose work with Indigenous women in Guatemala who were involved, who were dealing with the legacy of conflict in Guatemala. She very much speaks to how the women used photography to develop a shared story of the violence that had taken place, and they repeatedly talked to the positive effects of the participatory image making process and Photovoice process on themselves and on their local communities, and self-understanding, self-esteem. But she also warns against romantic accounts of how photography gives voice, and says that the way that participants use photography evolved over time, and what emerged was not so much a particular coherent voice or story, but rather an unfolding process of becoming active players in the mediated world of self-representation, politics, and social struggle. And that is very much how I understand this idea of photography of becoming, and what Photovoice and participatory forms of image making can do within this idea of photography for peace. So I'm going to stop there. Huge apologies for all the technical hitches. I can make all my slides available online, so I'll make sure that hopefully can be saved with the recording, so you could have a flick through them. But I'd love to hear from people, thoughts, questions. Yeah, I'll hand back over to you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. This was so insightful. And don't worry about the tech, we've all been there. I welcome, great presentation, positive comments for you. And if you have any questions for Tiffany too, it's now the time.
And one thing I would say is, often with these presentations, when I'm trying to give an overview of the research, it really doesn't do justice to the individual projects and contexts that they're working in. So I would really, anyone who wants to follow the project, I will be publishing and doing individual case studies of each project. They're very much there to, I guess, give more exposure to the different forms of methods, different forms of participatory image making that practitioners are using in post-conflict contexts. So I very much hope that other researchers and practitioners can draw on them. I'm just seeing a question here, reclaiming space footage. An example of participatory photography work moving from individual and community to beyond. Well, a specific example, definitely. I mean, I think all of these projects do that in different forms. So, I mean, of course, I guess the exciting thing about working with images, and why I guess so many of us are probably get so enthused by Photovoice is because of its potential to work at all different levels, and in terms of affecting change, that what makes it so potent, because images travel, and that's so key, especially when working with conflict affected communities, because they don't often have the luxury of being able to move, and their voices are often excluded in terms of national conversations or even policy level conversations about peace building interventions and mechanisms. So for example, in Rwanda and in Colombia, all those projects are exhibited in the capitals. There's media work that's done, social media work. So there's a way for their images to move beyond the community. But I think what's so compelling about the work I've been seeing is seeing these very inventive ways that practitioners are using the participatory image making process in the context of the community to really support grassroots peace building processes. And often when things move beyond the community, that would be a kind of further stage of the project. I'm just having a look, and someone's asking about therapeutic photography. Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to go into the Northern Ireland case study, but Belfast Exposed have been working over 30 years, and it's incredible. Their community engaged photography work is just amazing, because it really gives you a sense of how, I guess, applications of participatory image making can adjust according to the needs of communities as they pass through different phases of the different post-conflict phases. So when Belfast Exposed first started working, they were doing a lot of social justice project, photo voice and participatory and community engaged projects around issues such as housing. As you know, the legacy of conflict in Northern Ireland, you know, one of these legacies now is the kind of PTSD issues. There's a really high level of young male suicide in Northern Ireland. And what Belfast Exposed has found is, as these community needs have arisen, they've worked with all sorts of groups all over Belfast and Northern Ireland. And they were being called on more and more to do work with mental health and with people who were dealing with the legacy of war. So they've developed all sorts of strategies around group and personal processes where they use their archive. So Belfast Exposed have built up this archive of community photography over 30 years. And these archival images become a starting point for conversations. And then people go on and develop their own photographic work. It's often done one-on-one or in small group settings. The example that I was going to show you is a former soldier who was dealing with kind of deep-seated trauma from going back to his time that he was serving. And he, through the photographic archive, revisited some of the places where he had been serving. And it's incredible, because he almost, this goes back to this idea of images as mediators for difficult subjects. It was almost easier to kind of start to, I guess, revisit some of these sites visually rather than physically, but reworking it visually, he would then return to the sites and rephotograph them. And he's created these images of places which were deeply significant for him from his experience during the conflict. And he's been using that as a way, I guess, to kind of come to terms with the history, his own experience. So that's where the therapeutic photography comes in. I think there's a wealth of other work around photo voice as forms of therapeutic photography, and I've got some stuff on my website about that if anyone wants to look. I will put a link to the Imaging Peace Instagram. That's a good place to start for people who are asking how to follow. And my Twitter is I always post everything there, so I'll put links to that and make sure that they're available. I've just seen someone's in Chiapas. That's fantastic. You must be in touch with the Chiapas Photography Project. Their work is incredible. I didn't get a chance to speak about them. But are we out of time now, Erica? I'm not sure how we're doing for time.
We're a couple minutes after, so I think you did well. Everything.
Well, apologies once again. The beauty of the Prezi thing is I can share an online link to, and make it public to anyone who wants to have a look at some of the videos and materials from the project, because of course that's really the important stuff, is seeing some of the images from the work. But huge thanks once again to all the Photovoice Worldwide team and to everyone for listening.
Thank you very much for being here once again, Tiffany, and thank you for everyone that came here today. This was an incredible talk. Once again, we're very grateful to you.